Pete never planned on being a soldier, not at first. He was just 17, a regular kid in a regular town, working odd jobs, messing around with his best friend Carlo, and listening to the world fall apart on the radio. The war felt far away until one morning, December 7th, 1941, when the news broke through the static like a fist to the chest. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had struck, and everything changed. But for Pete, it wasn't just about patriotism or revenge. It was personal. Carlo's brother was there, he'd say years later, his voice dropping low. He never made it back. Carlo didn't cry, not in front of anybody. But I saw it in his eyes. That silence. It said everything. The two of them decided that day what they were going to do. No waiting to be drafted. No watching from the sidelines. "We're going in the Navy," Carlo had said. And Pete nodded, like it was already decided. The thing was, Pete knew he might not even make it through the door. He was colorblind, and that damn color test was enough to keep a good man out. They used these cards, all dots and colors, with numbers hidden in them. If you couldn't see the number, you failed. Simple as that. And Pete had never passed one in his life. But Carlo had a plan. "Just listen," he whispered as they stood in line at the recruitment center. "I'll go first. When I call out the numbers, you remember them." Pete nodded, heart pounding, palms sweaty. Carlo went in, sat down, and started calling them out, clear and loud enough for Pete to catch. 99, 44, 70. It sounded strange, hearing him say it like that, but Pete got it, memorized it. When it was his turn, he stepped inside and tried to act calm. The officer flipped over the first card. "Tell me what number you see." Pete didn't hesitate. 99, another card. 34, another. 70. It worked, until the officer fumbled a card and it didn't flip fully. "How'd you know what number that was?" the man asked, eyeing him close. Pete shrugged and smiled. "I'm in the Army. They both knew it." Navy or not, Pete wasn't going home. Basic training wasn't glamorous. They sent him to Dothan, Alabama, to a place everyone called Tar Paper City. It wasn't even a real camp, just a bunch of wooden poles in the ground wrapped in tar paper, like someone's bad idea of a shelter. The beds were cots on top of sand, and the nights were freezing. But Pete didn't care. He was in. That was all that mattered. What came next moved fast. The Army didn't waste time when the world was on fire. Pete was shipped to the United Kingdom for further training, this time as part of the 283rd Field Artillery Battalion. He was learning how to move big guns, the kind that could level a building, and he was good at it. Focused, determined, quiet. He didn't talk much about home. Then came the day they told him where they were. Going. Normandy, France, D-Day, June 6, 1944. They landed on Utah Beach after the first wave of infantry had already gone in and taken the worst of it. Pete remembered the silence, how quiet everything seemed at first, like the world had just stopped breathing. But then the sounds came. Gunfire, explosions, shouting, the crash of metal and the sting of salt in the air. They drove their artillery off the LSTs, huge landing ships with metal, ramps that dropped onto the beach like jaws opening. Pete was behind the wheel, pulling trailers loaded with firepower. "You didn't think about dying," he said later. "You just drove." At night they moved in darkness. No headlights, no noise. Just tiny cat eyes, little green glow markers the size of a fingernail, on the backs of the jeeps ahead of them. That was all you could see. If you lost sight of those eyes, you were lost. If you turned on a light, you were dead. The Germans were in the sky, Pete remembered. And they didn't miss. Most nights, they made it through. But not all. There were close calls, the kind you don't forget. "You feel it in your bones," Pete said. "Even now." And that was just the beginning. They didn't stop after Normandy. Once Pete and the 283rd Field Artillery Battalion made it onto the beach and set up their gear, they were on the move again, always pushing forward, always chasing the enemy out of one town and into the next. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. The next major stop was St. Lo. It had been a quiet French town once, full of cobblestone streets and red-roofed houses. But now it was German-held territory, and it had been that way for 4 years. The Allies wanted it bad. The Germans wanted to keep it. And in between the two were young boys like Pete, carrying more weight than any 17-year-old should. That place was a meat grinder, Pete would say, voice low and steady. Something like 22 days of non-stop fighting, day and night. They fought through ruined houses and shattered streets. Some buildings were still standing when they arrived. Most were rubble when they left. St. Lo was where Pete saw what real loss looked like, the kind you don't get over. Their general, a good man, known for never hiding behind the lines, was killed early on. He didn't wear a steel helmet, just a liner, and that one choice cost him his life. They always told us, if you're caught without a steel helmet, it's a court-martial. That's your life. Well, they found him with half his head gone. Just like that. Pete didn't dwell on it too long. No one could. They didn't have time. The Germans were everywhere. Snipers in windows, mortars from the hills, mines underfoot. You didn't sleep, he said. You didn't eat right. You didn't even think. You just kept moving. By the 5th day, they were deep into the town. On the 7th, they started pushing the Germans out. By the 10th, the enemy was running, but not far. That was how the war worked. You'd win a town one day, lose it the next, take it again a week later. You never really felt like you were winning. It was just survival, inch by inch. They went through Colmar, Cologne, Frankfurt, cities that once had history and beauty, turned to dust and silence. Pete saw whole blocks flattened, churches with their spires snapped like matchsticks, statues decapitated, homes hollowed out like shells. You couldn't recognize anything, he said. Sometimes we didn't even know where we were. You'd see a brick wall still standing, but nothing else. That was the town. But they kept going. Sometimes they'd get a break. A couple days to regroup, clean their weapons, maybe even grab a hot meal. But the war didn't pause. And in December of 1944, just before Christmas, Hitler made one final move, his last gamble. The Germans launched a massive surprise attack. Thousands of men and tanks hit the American lines hard, right in the Ardennes forest. It was fast, brutal, and effective. The Allies were caught, completely off guard. It became the biggest battle the U.S. would fight in the entire war. They called it the Battle of the Bulge. Pete was in the thick of it. 1 minute we were moving forward. The next, we were trapped. Just like that. We didn't know where it came from. It was like they came out of the ground. So many of them. So fast. They couldn't move. Supplies were cut off. Snow was everywhere. And the cold was like something alive, biting through every layer of clothing. They had us surrounded, he said. No way out. We dug in, waited, and hoped somebody would come. A lot of my friends didn't make it. Guys right next to you, 5 feet away, gone. Just like that. You start wondering, why not me? For days, Pete and his unit held their ground. Hungry, cold, low on ammo. Every day felt like it would be the last, but they refused to surrender. Help finally came. The 42nd Division. Tough men who punched their way through the snow and gunfire to break the Germans' grip. Pete never forgot them. They saved us. Simple as that. That battle was the worst of it. After that, it was over. The Germans didn't have anything left. But the war wasn't done just yet. After the Battle of the Bulge, something shifted. It wasn't just about strategy anymore. Pete could feel it in the air, in the way the German soldiers moved, in the silence between the gunshots. The war wasn't over, but the fight in them was dying. They looked tired. Pete said. Not just physically, inside, like they knew, like it was all falling apart. His battalion kept moving, pushing through shattered cities and hollowed-out towns. The weather didn't help. Rain, sleet, freezing winds that cut through uniforms like knives. But even worse was the smell. Smoke. Rot. Something more sour than just death, like history itself, was burning. And then came the moment that would never leave him. Dachau. It was the first concentration camp built by the Nazis, the place where it all started. Pete didn't even know where they were going until they got close. There were whispers among the soldiers, something about a prison, something about a camp. But no one understood. Not really. Not until they saw it. There was smoke coming out of the buildings, Pete said. At first, I thought maybe they were just burning trash. Then I saw the chimneys. Then the bodies. The crematoriums were still running when the 283rd arrived. They walked past fences topped with barbed wire, past guard towers that still had Nazi soldiers in them, hands in the air, surrendering before anyone said a word. The men didn't even try to run. They didn't beg. They just stood there, blank-faced, like their own souls had already left their bodies. The camp was full of people, if you could still call them that. Skin and bone, eyes too big for their faces. Some couldn't even walk. Some crawled. Others just sat on the ground, staring into space. They didn't even speak, like language itself had been taken from them. I still see their faces, Pete would whisper. Even now, 70 years later, I still see them. There were buildings full of clothes, shoes, glasses, all stripped from the victims before they were sent to die. Pete walked into one room and saw a pile of human hair, another with baby clothes. You don't forget something like that, he said. You just don't. He didn't talk much about Dachau after the war. Not with his family, not with his friends. Even decades later, he could barely mention it without going quiet. Some memories aren't meant for sharing. Some don't need words. They live in the spaces between silence. But if you asked him what stuck the most, he'd tell you it wasn't the bodies or the smoke or even the soldiers who ran the camp. It was the children. Some of them were still alive, he said. Barely. Kids with numbers tattooed on their arms. They'd look at you like you were from another planet, like they didn't believe we were real. Pete and his unit did what they could, shared their food, gave away their water, carried those who couldn't walk. But it never felt like enough. How do you save someone who's already been through hell? He asked. You can't. You can only take them away from it. They stayed at the camp for days, helping, organizing, waiting for the Red Cross and other Allied forces to arrive with proper medical help. When they finally moved on, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like shame. Not our shame, Pete said, but human shame, that we let it get that far. After Dachau, the war felt different, quieter, sadder. The enemy started surrendering in larger numbers. Some German soldiers threw down their weapons and raised their hands before the Americans even reached them. They just wanted it to end, Pete said. You could see it in their eyes. Most of them didn't care anymore. They weren't fighting for Hitler. They were just trying to get home alive. But they didn't want to surrender to the Russians. That much was clear. They'd do anything to avoid the Soviets, Pete explained. They knew what they had coming. The Russians weren't going to forgive them, not after what happened in the East. That was personal. Pete understood. He didn't blame them for being scared, not after what he'd seen. Still, the end was coming fast now. Word was spreading that Hitler was in a bunker. Berlin was under siege. Every day felt like it could be the last day of the war, but no one dared to believe it yet. Not after all that. Spring rolled in quietly, almost unnaturally calm. The fighting was still happening, yes, here and there, in small pockets, like fires that hadn't quite gone out. But it wasn't the chaos of Normandy, or the horror of St. Lo, or the terror of the bulge. No, this was something different now, something slower, heavier, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally say it was over. But Pete didn't trust quiet anymore. Not after everything he'd seen. Not after Dachau. "You don't get to relax in war," he said. "You don't ever fully exhale, because the second you do, that's when something hits you." They kept pushing deeper into Germany. Every day they saw more soldiers laying down their weapons, more white flags made of shirts or tablecloths hanging from windows. In some towns, the locals barely even looked at them, just stood in the doorways, watching the American trucks roll by with a kind of numb acceptance. They weren't angry anymore, Pete said. They were just empty. And the ones who did speak, the German civilians, mostly old men and women, sometimes children, they said the same thing over and over. "We didn't know." Pete didn't argue. What was the point? Maybe they hadn't. Maybe they chose not to. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. I just remember thinking, we sure as hell knew now. The roads were lined with wreckage, burned-out tanks, abandoned carts, the bodies of horses and men alike, left to rot. Bombed bridges forced the convoy to take long, winding detours. Food was short. Sleep was shorter. Pete had stopped counting the days. But then, one night, the news came. Hitler was dead. Shot himself in a bunker in Berlin. Pete was sitting on a crate when someone passed the word down. At first, he didn't believe it. Then he just nodded and said nothing. There was no celebration. No wild cheering. Just a strange, quiet understanding. "We'd given too much to start dancing now," he said. A few days later, the official announcement came. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Pete was 20 years old. He should have felt relief. Joy, maybe. But mostly, he just felt tired. Deep down tired. Like his bones were carrying the weight of every face he'd seen buried in rubble. Every friend he'd lost in a foxhole. Every kid he'd helped carry out of Dachau. "We were too young to be that old," he said. The next few months were a blur of cleanup and organization. Helping refugees, guarding roads, clearing mines. The army didn't just pack up and go home after the surrender. There was still work to do, and lots of it. Pete met civilians, Germans, Polish, Belgians, people trying to piece their lives back together from whatever was left. Some of them would bring coffee, bread, even wine, just to say, "Thank you." Others stared at the Americans like ghosts. But no matter where they went, Pete noticed something. The fear of the Soviets. "They'd rather throw themselves into our arms than take one step east," he said. In the weeks that followed, the roads were full of Germans trying to escape Russian-occupied territory. They fled with carts, bikes, on foot. Anything to avoid being caught by the Red Army. Pete didn't know exactly what had happened in the East, but he knew it wasn't good. You could see it in their faces. They were terrified. Some begged us to take their families. They didn't want money, just mercy. And then finally, after months of waiting, it came. The orders to go home. January 1946. The war was behind them. Pete boarded a ship in the English Channel, surrounded by men just like him. Some laughed. Some cried. Others just stood at the rail, watching the cold water pass below, wondering how the hell they were still alive. "We didn't talk about it on the boat," he said. "Not much. We just stared." I think we were all wondering the same thing. What now? When they docked, the crowd was massive. Flags, music, families, a sea of people waving at soldiers they'd never met but owed everything to. Some were crying, some were shouting. Others didn't even have jackets on. Too excited to care about the cold. Pete didn't wave back. He just looked. That welcome. I'll never forget it. Not for the rest of my life. But his own family? They had no idea he was even in the country yet. The ship pulled in late after dark. Cold wind blew in off the docks, and Pete stood on the deck, watching as the port filled with people. Flags waved. Kids sat on shoulders. Women held signs with names scrawled in thick black letters. It was a welcome home celebration, but for Pete, it didn't quite feel real. He didn't see his family. He didn't expect to. They had no idea he was coming. After the long line of men cleared off the boat, Pete grabbed his duffel bag and found his way to the nearest bus station. He bought a ticket and waited in silence, the muffled buzz of conversation all around him. A kid next to him was laughing. Another guy was sleeping upright, mouth open, snoring like a chainsaw. But Pete wasn't tired. His nerves were alive again. He stared out the window the entire ride, watching the landscape change. First small towns, then open stretches of road he almost remembered, and then, finally, the familiar edges of home. It was 1:45 in the morning when the bus pulled into the station. Pete stepped off, duffel over his shoulder, boots thudding on the pavement. The streets were nearly empty. The air was sharp with cold, and for the first time in years, he was standing in his own country, free, alive, and just a few miles from the house he grew up in. But there was no one waiting. So, he walked to the payphone, dropped in a coin, and dialed home. On the second ring, someone picked up. "Hello?" His father's voice came through, groggy and rough from sleep. "Dad," Pete said, smiling into the receiver. "I'm at the bus station." A pause. Then, "Who is this?" "It's Pete," he said. "Your son," another pause. Then his father's voice cracked. "You're where?" "I'm at the station. Just got in." There was a shuffle on the line, footsteps, a door creaking. Pete could hear his father's breath quicken. "Your brother's on midnight shift," his dad said. "He won't be off till 7:30. "I don't even know who I could send," Pete chuckled. "Don't worry about it. I'll take a cab." But while Pete hung up and waited outside, his father picked the phone right back up. He called Timken, the factory where Pete's older brother Hobart worked, and told the night manager, "You get Hobart Shaw right now and tell him his brother's down at the bus station. Go get him." A few minutes later, headlights swept across the street. A car rolled by slowly, then stopped, reversed, and pulled up right in front of Pete. The door opened, and there was Hobart, eyes wide with disbelief. "I'll bet you that's Pete," he said, already stepping out of the car. It was. They didn't say much at first, just a long hug and a few hard slaps on the back. Sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes you don't need them. They got to the house at exactly 2:00 in the morning. February 9th, his mother was crying before he even stepped through the door. His father couldn't stop staring at him, like he was afraid to blink and make him disappear again. And Pete? He just stood in the middle of the living room, duffel still in hand, boots still dusted with places no one in that house had ever seen. He was home, but he wasn't. The same boy who'd left. That was a long spell, he would later say. Longer than anyone in that room would ever understand. Pete had made it back in one piece. Or at least, that's what everyone saw. His arms were strong, his voice calm, his smile still crooked in the same way his mother remembered. But something inside had shifted, something silent. And even though no one asked, he could feel the questions hanging in the air. Did you kill anyone? Did you see death? Did it change you? People meant well. Friends dropped by. Neighbors baked pies. Old teachers from high school sent letters with words like hero and bravery. Pete appreciated it. He did, but none of them really understood. Not his mother, who cried every time she looked at him. Not his brother, who had worked factory shifts while Pete was dodging shells in St. Lo. Not even Carlo, who had made it into the Navy after all, and come home with his own war stories. But nothing quite like Pete's. Pete didn't sleep well those first few weeks. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweat sticking to his shirt, heart pounding like a gun was going off. Sometimes he swore he could still hear those cat eyes in the dark. those tiny lights they used in the convoy, glowing in front of him like eyes in the trees. Other times, it was the sound of screaming that followed him into his dreams. Sometimes it was German, sometimes English, and sometimes no words at all, just fear. He didn't talk about Dachau, not even once. He'd start a sentence, pause, and then just shake his head. His father once asked what the worst part of the war was. Pete stared at the wall for a long time before saying, "Some things shouldn't have ever happened." There were moments he felt more alone at home than he ever did on the battlefield. At least in the war, the people around him understood. They'd seen the same things. They knew what it meant to carry someone you liked in your arms and feel their blood soak into your shirt. At home, people talked about ration stamps, about gas prices, about how long the war took to end. But Pete remembered the smell of burning towns. He remembered the boy from Ohio, who bled out whispering for his mother. He remembered everything, so he kept it to himself. Instead, he helped his father around the house, chopped wood, fixed the roof, took long walks with his brother down the railroad tracks. He'd go into town for coffee and pretend to listen when the shop owner talked politics. Everyone wanted to know what the future held. Would there be another war? Would the Soviets turn on us? Would things ever go back to normal? Pete didn't have answers. He wasn't even sure what normal meant anymore. One afternoon, a neighbor brought over her teenage son, a shy, skinny kid named Roger, who was thinking about joining the army. "He wants to hear what it's like," she told Pete. "From someone who's been there." Pete looked at the kid, looked at his nervous hands, his wide eyes, the way he fidgeted with the brim of his cap, and all he said was, "War's not like the movies, son." Roger nodded, unsure what to say. His mother thanked Pete for his time and walked the boy home. Pete sat on the porch alone for a while, watching the wind stir the trees and thinking about the boys who never made it home to their porches. There were a lot of them, more than he'd ever be able to count. People in town started calling him the lucky one. Pete didn't argue, but luck, to him, meant waking up every day knowing that someone else didn't. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a witness, and that, maybe, was worse. Spring melted into summer, and Pete stayed busy. That's how he coped, by moving, fixing, working. If he wasn't patching something in the house, he was helping a neighbor dig a fence or hauling lumber for a barn. His hands always had something to do, even if his mind drifted elsewhere. He didn't talk much about the war, but people still asked, usually not directly. They'd ask about Europe, about the food, the towns, what the women were like, as if it had been a kind of long, dangerous vacation. But sometimes, after a few drinks, someone would lean in closer and ask the real question, "Did you ever kill anyone?" Pete never answered. He'd just smile politely and change the subject. Not because he couldn't talk about it, but because he didn't want to explain something that would only echo in the empty air between them. You couldn't explain the sound of a man dying right next to you. You couldn't explain what it's like to hold your rifle and know someone's running toward you with a grenade in his hand. You couldn't explain why your hands still shook sometimes when the thunder rolled too loud. So Pete just kept living, quietly, steadily. There were things that helped, though. Small, simple things. The smell of his mother's bread in the morning, the feel of fresh laundry on a summer line, the way his dog, the same one he'd left behind, wagged its tail so hard every time it saw him, like he was still that same 17-year-old boy who used to sneak at bacon under the table. One morning, Pete walked down to the river, just outside of town. He hadn't been there since before the war. The trees were taller now, the rocks smoother from the current. He sat on the same big flat stone he used to fish from as a kid. He didn't bring a rod this time, just sat, listened to the water move. He thought about Carlo, his best friend, The one who got him into the line at the recruiter's office. The one who shouted the color test answers for him. The one who joined the Navy and never came back from the Pacific. Pete had made it. Carlo didn't. That was the kind of thing you never made peace with. Later that day, Pete found an old box in the attic. Inside were letters, some unopened, some sent to him from buddies who were long gone. There were also a few small mementos, a bullet casing from Normandy, a patch from a German uniform, a photo of his unit standing in front of a muddy jeep, faces smiling through exhaustion, and folded beneath it all, a French flag, stained with dirt and soot, the corners fraying. He held it in his hands a long time. That flag wasn't from a souvenir shop. It was from a house in St. Lo. A little boy had handed it to him after the fighting stopped. No words, just reached out and gave it to Pete, like a gift, like a thank you. At the time, Pete had just nodded and tucked it into his coat. He'd forgotten about it. But now, years later, holding it again, he felt something deep in his chest shift, a tightness loosening. Not all the way, but enough. He thought about going back, to France, to see the towns, the streets, the fields, not in uniform, not with a weapon, just as a man, a survivor, but he wasn't sure yet. That kind of thing takes time. Healing is slow, and some parts of you never come all the way back. Years passed. The uniform was packed away, the medals placed in a drawer, and Pete moved on the best way he knew how, quietly, humbly, and with his head down. He got a job, steady work, and built a life. Not a loud one, not one full of speeches or parades, but a solid, honest life. He married a girl from the next town over, had kids, raised them with patience, kindness, and the quiet strength of someone who'd seen the worst of what people can do to each other. He never told them the full stories. Not right away, only little pieces here and there, like crumbs, enough to remind them where he'd been, but never so much that it would weigh on them. "You don't give the next generation your nightmares," he said once. "You give them your hope." For years, Pete stayed out of the spotlight. No interviews, no Veterans Day speeches, no sitting in front rows with pins on his chest. It wasn't about being modest. It was about not needing the world to know. He hadn't served for applause. He'd served because his country needed him, because his friend's brother had died in Pearl Harbor, because someone had to. But time, like war, has its own way of calling men back. In November of 2016, Pete got a letter in the mail. It had an official seal on it and words in French. At first he thought it might be a mistake, but when he read further, he realized what it was. The French government was awarding him the Legion of Honor, one of the highest decorations they could give. It was for his service in combat on French soil, for helping free a country he wasn't even born in, for driving those cat-eyed convoys in the dark and carrying artillery through broken cities, for surviving Dachau, for being one of the boys who never gave up. He didn't smile when he opened the letter. He didn't cry either. He just sat there quietly and let the weight of it settle in. Later that week, he stood in a small ceremony, suit pressed, hair combed, surrounded by men and women who had never seen war but knew enough to respect it. They pinned the medal on his chest, said a few words, and clapped. Pete nodded, shook hands, said thank you. But he wasn't thinking about medals. He was thinking about Carlo, about the general in St. Lo, about the kid in the foxhole who died calling for his mom, about the women at Dachau who couldn't walk, about the long road home and the moment his brother pulled up at 2 a.m., headlights cutting through the cold. He was thinking about what it cost to come home. "You gotta be friendly to people," he said to a reporter after the ceremony. "Try to understand them. I know a lot of people over there, even the English. They were so sorry to see us come. You know, that we had to leave our homes and come fight in theirs." He paused for a second, eyes glancing away. "And Poland, especially Poland. They thought so much of us for doing what we did. I told them we had to. That was just what it was. But their gratitude, that stuck with me. That kind of thing. It dwells on you. When the reporter asked what he thought about the world now, about how things had changed, Pete smiled faintly. You got to understand people, he said again. You got to try. That's the only way. And maybe that was the lesson Pete carried more than any other. That war destroys, yes. But it also reveals, it shows you what matters, who matters, and why it's worth protecting. He never looked for revenge, never clung to anger. He just remembered. That was his way of honoring the ones who didn't make it home. Not with hate, but with humility, with peace, and with the quiet, lasting strength of a man who walked through hell and made it back carrying not just scars, but grace.